Okay, picture this. It's 1947. A brand new nation, India, has just been born. And right out of the gate, it's facing this absolutely monumental task. How in the world do you educate hundreds of millions of people, spread all across a land of incredible diversity? You see, this wasn't just about building schools or printing books. No, this was about forging the very soul of a modern nation. And that whole incredible journey, it all started with one massive question.
And really, that's the central question, isn't it? I mean, how do you even begin to build an education system for what would eventually become a nation of 1 billion people? This wasn't some academic exercise. This was the cold, hard reality facing India's first leaders. How do you create a system that works for everyone? From a kid in a tiny remote village to a student in a massive bustling city. This single question, this one challenge, would literally drive decades and decades of policy, fierce debate, and constant reform.
So, right from the get-go, the goals they set were, well, they were incredibly ambitious. Education wasn't just about reading and writing. No, it was seen as this powerful tool for nation building. It had to instill democratic values. It had to promote real equality for all. It needed to help unite this incredibly diverse country. And of course, it had to drive economic development for a better future. These 4 big ideas, they basically became the guiding stars for every single thing that came next.
All right, so you've got this grand vision. What's next? Well, you've got to bring in the architects, right? So that's exactly what India did. They set up these high-powered commissions, basically teams of experts, to draw up the actual blueprints for the entire educational structure. This was the really critical planning phase.
And you'll see that a lot of the really critical thinking, the foundational stuff, happened in those first couple of decades right after independence. The Mudaliar Commission and the Kothari Commission, in particular, these were the heavy hitters. They really laid the groundwork. And then a little later down the line, the focus would eventually shift to the teachers themselves, which is, of course, a huge piece of the puzzle.
What's interesting is that each of these early commissions was zeroing in on a very specific problem. So back in '52, the Mudaliar Commission was looking at the content of education. They basically said, hey, this stuff is way too bookish, too theoretical, and has nothing to do with real life. So their solution was to make learning more practical. Then, just 12 years later, the Kothari Commission comes along, and they look at the structure. They realize the whole system was kind of a mess with no real unity. Their big goal was to create one single national system for everyone.
And one of the Mudaliar Commission's really big ideas was this concept of a multi-purpose school. Think about it. A single school where a student could study traditional subjects like history and math, but also learn a technical trade or a hands-on vocational skill. The whole point was to tear down that wall between just learning from books and actually doing practical, real-world work.
Okay, now let's talk about the Kothari Commission's most famous, most lasting contribution. And honestly, this is something a lot of you will probably recognize. It's the 10 + 2 + 3 pattern. It's so simple but so powerful. It created a standard structure for the entire country. 10 years of general education, then 2 years of higher secondary, and finally, a 3-year degree course. This little formula brought a ton of much-needed order to what was a pretty chaotic educational landscape.
So, okay, we've got the blueprints from these commissions. They look great on paper. But a blueprint is just that, paper. The next phase, and you could argue was way, way harder, was actually turning these big ideas into real policy and, more importantly, real action on the ground.
And this is pretty much how it worked. In 1986, India rolled out its huge, landmark National Policy on Education, the NPE. Think of this as the big, ambitious vision document. But crucially, they knew a vision alone wasn't going to cut it. So in 1992, they followed it up with something called the Program of Action. This was the nuts and bolts, a detailed, time-bound roadmap for how to actually get it all done. So, vision first, then a concrete plan to make it happen.
And if you want a perfect example of that action, look no further than Operation Blackboard. This was one of the signature programs from that 1986 policy, and the goal was so simple but so powerful. It was to make sure that every single primary school in the country had the absolute bare essentials. We're talking at least 2 teachers, 2 classrooms, and basic learning stuff, blackboards, maps, even some toys. It was this massive, nationwide push just to get the basic infrastructure up to a minimum standard.
But Operation Blackboard, as big as it was really just one piece of the puzzle. The 1986 policy was, wow, it was incredibly comprehensive. It was pushing for universal education for all kids. It had a huge focus on equity, especially for women and for marginalized communities. It even created these special schools, Navodaya Vidyalayas, specifically to find and nurture gifted students from rural areas. And on top of all that, it was also trying to reform teacher education and modernize the whole curriculum. It was a lot.
Okay, so fast forward a bit. As India steps into the 21st century, the whole conversation starts to shift again. It wasn't just about getting kids into schools or building classrooms anymore. The new question was deeper, more fundamental. It was, in this rapidly changing world, how should our children actually be learning?
And the new buzzword you started hearing everywhere, especially from the National Knowledge Commission, was this goal to turn India into a knowledge society. What does that even mean? Well, it meant going way beyond just basic reading and writing. The new goal was to raise a generation of kids who are critical thinkers, innovators, and creative problem solvers. People who could really thrive in a globalized, information-rich world.
Now, to do that, you had to completely rethink what happens inside a classroom. And that's where the National Curriculum Framework of 2005, or NCF 2005, comes in. And the shift it proposed was dramatic. It was all about moving away from just memorizing facts and figures for an exam and moving towards developing a real, deep, conceptual understanding. The whole idea was to get knowledge to leap off the pages of a textbook and connect with a child's actual life.
And this quote, this really captures the entire spirit of the NCF 2005 perfectly. Integration of knowledge with life outside school. It sounds so simple, right? But that one phrase represents a massive philosophical change. It's a move towards a way of learning that's all about the child, about their experiences, and about making education actually meaningful.
And listen, on paper, this framework was brilliant. I mean, it put the student right at the center of the universe. It was designed to spark creativity and critical thinking. It really hammered home the importance of inclusive classrooms for all kids. And maybe most importantly, it totally changed the role of the teacher. You're no longer the sage on the stage just lecturing. You're the guide on the side, a facilitator helping students discover things for themselves.
But this is a really big but. Here comes the reality check. This incredibly forward-thinking approach ran into some massive real-world problems. For one, it depends on having highly skilled, well-trained teachers who know how to facilitate, not just lecture, and that's a huge ask. It was also super difficult to implement in rural areas where schools just didn't have the resources. And think about it, how do you grade creativity on an exam? It posed huge challenges for assessment. It really required a level of infrastructure that frankly just wasn't there in many places.
So, when you step back and look at this entire journey, from that initial founding vision all the way through these huge sweeping policies, there's one single thread that runs through it all. One enduring challenge that really defines the whole story.
And here's the crucial takeaway from all of this. When you really dig into the decades of reports and commissions and policies, one thing becomes crystal clear. The gap has never, ever been in the vision. India has consistently produced ambitious, progressive, even world-class ideas for education. The problem has never been a lack of brilliant blueprints.
No, the real challenge, the persistent, nagging, enduring one, has always been implementation. It's about turning those brilliant plans into a widespread reality on the ground, in every single classroom for every single child. That gap, the one between the beautiful policy on paper and the day-to-day practice in the school, that has been the central struggle of India's entire educational story.
Which, of course, leaves us with one final big question to think about. After all these decades, all these cycles of planning and reform, what is the next great challenge for India's education system? Is it still just about closing that gap between vision and reality? Or in today's world, is there a completely new hurdle emerging for the next generation?